Hi, my name is Rafi Ajl, and I run The Long Confidence, a small design studio based in Berkeley, California. We focus on furniture and sculptural and collectible design works in a variety of mediums: brass, wood, glass, and increasingly other experimental stuff as well. I'm pretty stoked to be answering some questions for you over on Design Milk Milkshake. So let's reach into the bowl, which is not exactly a bowl. It's one of our sculptural vessels made out of glass, and see what the Magic 8 Ball has to say. All right. Tell us what you mean when you say your work is brutally handmade. For sure. So our work is made with labor. It's the result of dozens or hundreds or even thousands of very small steps and very small decisions. It's glorified manual labor. It's beautiful. We are making kind of sculptural and exquisite objects, but at the end of the day, we're using our blood, our sweat, and our tears, so to speak, to make these beautiful things. With furniture or with object making, there's no one kind of like magical transcendent moment when the thing becomes a thing, when the table becomes a table. It's just the result of this linear progression as you move through a process that is like really instilled with all of this labor and all of this work to arrive at this thing. And so when I also call it brutal, I think about our practice in terms of its concern with kind of material thresholds, with pushing materials to their limits, to kind of extremes, to breaking points, and seeing what happens. We do a lot of work, say, with crazy molds, or experimenting with what happens when you just push something to its breaking point or its failure, and kind of that chaos and extremes of the material and its potentials. And that's kind of what I think about in terms of like brutality as well. So it's twofold. It's kind of like what we do to the material, but also in some ways it's what the material does to us because of the amount of labor and time and intensity that goes into kind of like making these really beautiful and special things. Can you walk us through the process and inspiration for one of your saguaro glass pieces? So I've got some saguaro glass right here. Pretty cool. There's also some on the shelf kicking around behind me, or a lot on the shelf kicking around behind me. And that came from a place of wanting to work in a more gestural and fluid way. So primarily our work has been a lot of wooden furniture, tables, chairs, a lot of seating and things like that. And that demands a very focused approach. It's very meticulous. When you're dealing with wooden joinery, the tolerances are very, very small. And it's not a material, wood, that lends itself to being particularly gestural or plastic. And so when you think about plastic materials like glass or ceramics, things that you can really kind of use your body to impact and manipulate, I knew that I wanted to have this way of working a little bit more freely. And we had always worked with glass with our kind of tabletop collection, which are mold blown glass pieces. But I wanted to kind of deconstruct that idea. So I took a traditional wooden mold, but I kind of made it so there's chaos and chance possible in every time we use the mold. So here's actually one of the molds we use, which are kind of beautiful objects in their own right. And you can see that the molds are flexible. So every time you use the mold, even if you're blowing into the mold over and over again, because it's not a rigid structure, and also because it's wood and it tends to burn away, the results are going to be different and kind of chaotic each time. So that kind of thinks about the brutally handmade question from before. But I also just really was spending so much time thinking about how to work in this way that was much more fluid and expressive. And so this saguaro glass allows me to kind of work in that way that makes, I don't know, it makes me feel much freer in a certain way, and allows kind of more experimentation into kind of like pure form and kind of sculptural work, and working in this place where there's like a lot of uncertainty and chance into what's going on as well. You also work as a teacher. If you could snap your fingers and instill one single belief in your students, what would it be? What's the most valuable lesson they struggle to learn? Also kind of relating back to our process, because everything relates back to the process, I try to teach them curiosity and to be interested. And I know that that's like a funny thing to say, interested. Interesting is usually one of those throwaway words, but I think curiosity and interested go hand in hand, that there's a world in everything, in every object, in everything you see. And if you really study it and you're really curious about it, you could spend a lifetime kind of examining something and deconstructing all of its constituent parts and where it comes from and its histories. And so to say that you're curious about something is to be really interested in where it came from and how it's made and what it does and what it could be. So I really ask them to find that curiosity, find that thing that they're really curious about. For me, I'm curious about form, and I'm curious about process, and I'm also just super curious about materials. And so when we do stuff in the studio, things often start out as like a simple question, like what happens if we do X? So an example is we wanted to work in a different kind of gestural plastic way in the studio. So we started to work with pouring molten metal into molds. And of course, we weren't going to use a traditional mold because that's a thing that people do, and we're kind of interested in finding those edges and pushing into those maximums. So I made molds out of really dry wood. And so believe it or not, when you pour 2200 degree liquid bronze into a totally dry piece of wood, it catches on fire immediately. But because the wood is pretty thick, it doesn't catch fire all the way through, just the edges start to catch fire. And as the metal cools, it doesn't allow it to stay on fire for as long. And so what you get are these really beautiful things where, the wood kind of like burns away in these really subtle ways and like leaves you these beautiful textures. So these are just kind of like some experimental pieces that I have kicking around that I wanted to use as an example. But it starts from this fundamental question of like, what am I interested in? And then also like, what happens if you just do something? Because you're never going to do something right the first time, and you're probably not going to do something right the 10th time. But each time you learn through that iterative kind of curiosity process, and you can arrive at something really beautiful and really special. I got time for one more question here. What's been the most interesting discovery of your recent work with glass? That's a great one. So recently what we've actually been doing is experimenting and playing with just pure form and kind of almost in sculptural pieces. Like for so long, I've always been really obsessed with functionality, things that work. So most of our glass work has always been vessels, even if they're experimental and kind of interesting and a little crazy. It's always been kind of wedded to this idea of like, what could it do in someone's life that is useful? And I'm working on liberating myself from that, because I think it's important to try to get free and to kind of have fun and continue to experiment. So lately we've just been working on these sheets of glass, we're calling windows, and kind of these like sculptural kind of like pillow type forms. You might even see one kicking around if you look hard enough. And I'm really excited about these new directions of just like experimenting with pure form and kind of like pure beauty in a way, and not beauty in the sense of like pretty, but finding your own internal sense of poetics and what is beautiful for you. So I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you, Design Milkshake, for letting me answer some questions, and I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Thanks a lot. Bye.